Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Joanna Lei, a former KMT lawmaker in Taiwan, as well as a media executive in the US. Today is August 7, and only about 10 days ago, on the last weekend of July, we had a rather important extraordinary election in Taiwan. 24 KMT parliamentarians were under the threat of being unseated in a so-called mass recall or a general recall. Now, recalls are a proper constitutional measure in Taiwan to take down lawmakers before their mandate is over. It's a little bit like an impeachment for a president, because sometimes if somebody did something criminal or outrageous, you might want to get them out of office before their time is officially over. However, what we have never seen is a coordinated attack on so many parliamentarians at the same time, and all of them against KMT members. That is the party, of course, holding the majority in parliament at the moment, but not the executive branch, which is held by President Lai Ching-te, a DPP politician. Now, the recall failed spectacularly. All 24 MPs were reaffirmed by their constituencies. What this means is what we want to discuss today. So, Joanna, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for agreeing to this, because it's not always clear how to interpret the local politics in Taiwan. And since you've been working in it yourself and you are engaged with it, I think you can give us quite a bit of perspective. Clearly, you're obviously supporting the KMT side, but I would like to know about that. How are you interpreting this, being from the party that was so severely, kind of attacked on the legislative level? How are you reading what happened?
Well, I think we should term it as a general recall instead of a great recall, which is the term used by DPP. They thought that this great recall will give them a great success to overturn the KMT plus TPP majority in the Legislative Yuan. So the overall goal is to target all 31 districts held by the KMT MPs. And if they got recalled, even if they only got 6 or 7 recalled, then DPP can overturn the majority held by the coalition of KMT and TPP. So there are 3 characteristics that sets this recall apart from the others. The first one is initiated by the highest level of the party, even though they veiled it under civic organizations. Secondly, all MPs, all 31, were recalled indiscriminatorily. So there's no separation of the good or bad or satisfactory or unsatisfactory MPs. The third one is there is no real legal reasons to recall them. They didn't have corruption, embezzlement, or any other involvement in terms of a legal matter. And our previous recalls usually will have a legal matter. The 9 failed recall of individual MPs were based on legal reasons to recall them. But this is party-initiated, indiscriminatory, without any legal reason, and purely on political grounds.
Yeah, although it must be said that one more thing I want to precise for everybody. We have 3 parties that are very important in your parliament: KMT, the DPP, which also holds the presidency, and the TPP, right, with a T, right, not with a D. So, and the TPP and the KMT are basically the opposition that are able now to block the DPP in parliament, and that is a very unsatisfactory situation, of course, because the ruling, the executive branch doesn't have the legislative branch behind it. And what this seems from the outside is trying to overturn that without calling a general election, right? But by only attacking individual members. Now, the KMT, the DPP actually says that the KMT tried to counterattack them and also recall DPP members, but failed on the initial stage. So in order to do a recall, you first need to gather a certain number of signatures in those constituencies, and the DPP managed to do that. Or the DPP supporters managed to do that in these 31 districts, but in the districts for the DPP held by DPP members, KMT counterattack failed. Is that a fair assessment?
It is a clear assessment. Let me just add something. We have 5 branches of government: legislative, executive, legislative, judicial, and then we have 2 other branches which are uniquely in Taiwan. One is supervisory, another is for national examination. all 5 are held currently by DPP with the exception of legislative. So the other 4 branches are tied together with the executive power. Whoever wins the presidency will hold the other 4 branches. So legislative branch is the only branch that you can have a meaningful opposition. And therefore, the overturn of an opposition majority will be very critical if it happens that all 5 branches will be under DPP, which, will be characterized as a totalitarian system. Now, going back to your second question, recall has 3 phases. The first phase, you need to have 1% of the signature. Second phase is you need to get 10% of the signature in order to call a election, a ballot. And the third one is you need to have more than 25% of the local electors agreeing with the recall, and the ones disagreeing is smaller than that 25%. So there are 2 thresholds. More than 25%, and the ones who disagree has to be smaller. So if the disagree is higher, then you still don't recall them. The current DPP-led or DPP-associated groups-led recall has the first and second phases passed. So we held the first phase of election or balloting on July 22nd, and there will be a second phase on August 23rd. Now, the counter recall is actually a defensive move. When all DPP members were recalled, then when all KMT members were recalled or subject to recall, then KMT's legislators said, hey, wait a second, why are we going back to the public and being revoted? Why isn't it like the normal democracy that if the legislative yuan didn't pass anything, then the executive branch will send it back to the legislative yuan. If the legislative yuan still doesn't agree, then you dismiss the Congress and go for a general re-election to get new mandate. So now with this so-called general recall, only the opposition members got re-elected or were subject to re-election. The ruling party members are sitting very comfortably in the legislative yuan. So the counter recall is to address that particular problem and ask everybody to go back to the public and everyone to be re-examined by all the constituencies. However, the KMT-related groups-led recalls were subject to extremely high scrutiny by the prosecutorial branch, by the police and prosecutors, and they were then sent to the court. So none of them actually passed the 10% threshold, and therefore you only have KMT members subject to the July 22nd balloting and the August 23rd balloting.
So, yeah, and one of the things that the DPP keeps saying is that it didn't initiate as a party that recall. These were separate NGOs. These were civil society groups that are just so fed up with KMT politics that they thought it is now necessary, because I think the allegation is against the 31 lawmakers that they are too pro-China. They're not for Taiwan enough. They are basically traitors, and therefore they need to be unseated. But the DPP had no hand in this, is the official party line.
Okay, let me address it in 2 ways. The first one is the first public announcement or outcry of recall was initiated by the most senior party whip of DPP in the legislative yuan, Ke Jianming. He is the most senior member in the LY at this moment. There's no one more senior than him. And he's been the senior party whip of DPP for as long as you can remember. So he initiated this. Then you have a lot of civic groups, organizing individual district level recall movement, gathering signatures and so on and so forth. That is correct. But towards the end, before the July 26th, you have, starting from Lai Ching-te, Zhuo Rongtai, and also Minister of Internal Affairs, all the MPs, a lot of local officials, all came out standing on the platforms of those civic organizations and calling people to recall the KMT members. And the battle cry is your second point. The battle cry of all these is that we, DPP, is 抗中保台, anti-China, protecting Taiwan. They, KMT, is 亲中卖台, is pro-China and selling out Taiwan. And therefore, all the KMT members are not to be trusted and they should be recalled. So the battle cry was in the highest level of even in Taiwan's local presidential election. And those were articulated or voiced by the highest level of DPP members. So the bookends, the beginning and the end spaces have direct involvement of DPP members. And also even President Lai Ching-te did the so-called unity speeches to promote further escalation of the recall movement. So he himself is directly involved. So there's no denial that DPP initiated or at least announced it initially and then pushed the final phase at the end of the day.
Now, I mean, since all 24 recalls that happened 10 days ago, they all failed. I mean, the electorate chose to reappoint these people. It sends a pretty strong message, doesn't it? And what kind of light does it throw on the soon to come remaining 7 or so recalls that will be voted on the end of this month, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, the other 7 are more difficult to be defeated, quote unquote, by DPP because they didn't pass the initial 10%, the second phase 10% threshold and needed to be pushed back and back so that they're in the second phase. So these are more senior politicians with stronger local support. So they are harder to recall. However, the use of prosecutory or judicial forces will probably still play a role. And also the organizations making this election, all the mechanism of this election may still come to play. So people still have to be very careful. I added the judiciary as well as prosecutory is that in our general law of recall, 2016 was the first major amendment to lower the threshold to 1%, 10%, and 25%. But the second largest amendment happened in the end of last year to early this year that put criminal charges to the potential offenders of recall. Before, it was all executive processes. If you do not approve these signatures saying these are forged, then you send them back. You delete them from the total number and say you don't have enough number, go back and do the numbers. But towards the end of last year, they amended our recall law again, making it a potential of criminal offense.
This is a problem to the KMT, right? Because the KMT recall that they tried to launch against DPP members these people are now under investigation for forgery. So actually, DPP supporters are saying, oh, look, the KMT didn't only try to unsuccessfully counterattack, they even forged the signatures in order to get a recall, and they're basically criminals anyhow. They're now under investigation. And that connects to this stricter way of counting the signatures toward a recall.
Right. In the past, there were no noteworthy punishments of mistakes in the recall signature because you have a lot of civic groups going out to collect numbers and signatures. So some people may have signed it incorrectly. Others may have intentionally sabotaged your effort, sending you wrong numbers so that you get to be discredited, right? So there are a lot of potential misuse of this. But towards the end, in December and early this year, the law has changed so that they are now subject to up to 5 years of criminal, subject to up to 5 years of jail time, therefore making it possible to even incarcerate people before the evidence was clear. Let me just explain a little bit. Our current rules is that you can incarcerate people incommunicado, making them not communicate with anybody if they are suspected to have committed serious crime, which is defined by 5 years, up to 5 years of jail term. So last year, when this was revised, you make it possible for the prosecutors to ask for incarceration of anybody who have committed the so-called forgery of signature.
But was this law revised when KMT already held the majority of the legislative yuan?
Yeah, but I think it was the window because they just finished the election and there's nobody really paying attention. It was passed really quickly before the new term started.
So it was still passed by the old DPP majority legislative yuan.
I hate to accuse my other colleagues, but I think they just didn't pay attention because it's passed in the end of 2024, early 2025.
Okay. So, I mean, basically how a law change then can lead to unintended consequences down the road, because I think it was also the threshold for initiating a recall was lowered.
That's done in 2016, right after Tsai Ing-wen got elected.
Right. So, I mean, the accusation on one hand is, okay, this is an abuse of a legal instrument. On the other hand, the other side says, like, no, this is fine. This is the political process that we have. And actually, the outcome just confirms that the democratic process actually, makes sure that the will of the people is executed. Now, what does this mean since the DPP or the supporters put so much emphasis on this being a referendum, on the KMT being too pro-China? Exactly. What does this tell us about the general sentiment in Taiwan about this pro and anti-China rhetoric?
I think from the outside, a lot of international media actually made exactly that point, saying that since you've made it a referendum and the referendum has people spoken, because let me give you the number, a total of 6.1 million people, about 6.2 million people voted. That's about 32% of the entire island's voters. Of them, about 1.6 million voted for the recall. That's 26.4%. Another 2.3 million people voted against the recall. That's 37.4%, an 11% difference. So if it's a referendum, the referendum was not passed. It was actually pushed back by about 11% of at least 1/3 of all the people on Taiwan. However, voters, not people. But the DPP reaction from the top to the mid-level politicians is that, okay, this just shows you how mainland China has infiltrated Taiwan, has changed the social sentiment in Taiwan, and we need to be more careful about mainland China's infiltration. So you can see how they have twisted it and saying that it is not because we failed or people have spoken against this pro-China, anti-China sentiment, but it is because China was too clever and too smart and with too much influence in local politics. And that's also echoed by Lai Ching-te's final speech, because he said, let's push further and harder on the August 23rd second phase recall.
Do you think that this is actually true, or that just a significant number of voters were just annoyed with the entire affair and voted against the recall because in general they thought this was just a bad idea, so which would make it not an issue about pro anti-China, would make it an issue about, how people use the political system in order to take down their rivals. And second question, do you think that there was interference in this affair? And let's maybe focus on the accusation. Did China in any way, shape, or form, covertly or overtly through public pronouncements, try to influence the outcome?
China did congratulate Taiwan on the unsuccessful recall at the end of it after the day. But I think they were very careful in not to be seen as meddling in a domestic local affairs, because this, after all, is not presidential, it's individual legislator. But we are also seeing another force being at play here. You have a very heavy influence in the social media and data monitoring by a U.S.-supported group. So you can say maybe there are international interference, but it's not just China. There can also be a U.S. involvement there. But let me go back to how people reacted. Of course, after that Saturday, people started smiling, at least people I know started smiling on the street, because we've been subject to a lot of direct attack accusation by the civic groups for about 6 months. They claim that anybody who doesn't go sign them or sided with them are being pro-China, anti-Taiwan, not loving Taiwan. You have to leave. You are the impurities. You do not belong to this place. So they have abused that so-called civic power by even pressuring elderly and other weaker individual citizens. So there are 3 potential reasons of this final outcry. The first one is DPP has probably overplayed their anti-China card. They miscalculated how anti-China, the people in Taiwan, their anti-China sentiment was miscalculated or misrepresented by the entire civic group movements, because that was their number 1 party platform. In every legislator's recall reason, they have to submit a reason, say why we're recalling these people. They are being accused of pro-China and not loving Taiwan. So that's universal. So you cannot deny that's main theme of this campaign. But they're probably miscalculating the anti-China sentiment in Taiwan by DPP. The second one, I think, is really rational, showing the resilience and the democratic movements in Taiwan and how sound we are. People expect the government to do a good thing. They did not expect the government to focus just on political struggle and not focusing on immediate actions. So starting from the recall, you have the tariff, you have the typhoon, you also have people polarizing in society, you have a lot of confrontations. All of these are simple expectation. People simply expect DPP government to be able to deal with these issues. And the fact that it neglected these issues and continued to just focus on recall is quite disappointing to even their supporters. So that's number 2. And number 3 is you look at up and down the list of all the 24. By now, you can see that in no place they exceed a 28%-ish threshold. That's their ceiling. And that, to me, is the third miscalculation of DPP. DPP overestimated their support by using the anti-China card. They expect to bring in more people into their camp to recall the KMT legislators. But they didn't exceed their baseline, their core supporters. To date, being examined in 24 districts, it's still about 28%. So all 3 gave us the final results that the disagreement exceeds the agreement by 11%. More people disagree with this approach. And by the way, the voter turnout is 66%, extremely high, almost exactly the same as our presidential election, which is 70. So you can see that the polarizing forces is there. Everybody who has a right to vote came out and voted, and they spoke their mind.
And when you say that it was like 26% was versus 37, what am I missing? What's the remainder?
The remainder are the people who didn't vote.
Of the entire.
Yeah, because it's based on the total number of voters.
Right. So
eligible voters.
Right. Okay, of the total cake of eligible voters. Right. Okay. And then. Let's maybe discuss a little bit again about these NGOs, because as soon as we hear this, at least for the context of Europe, you immediately think of the ways in which institutions in the US try to influence politics abroad. And we know by now for certain that the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, they have entire programs of fostering NGOs in foreign countries in order to help them to create a kind of a facade of a civic movements that then support US interests abroad. This is now without doubt what happened in Ukraine. This is without doubt what was going on in Georgia. And this then is also supported by other forms of infiltration through the CIA. We know that for certain by now, even for Ukraine, like how since 2014 the CIA was there and was engaged. And of course, with Taiwan being such a pivotal part in the Pacific strategy, there must be ties on several levels. Now, are there any kind of fears that parts of the NGO environment in Taiwan might be benefiting from the same kind of financial flows from the US as for Europe?
Mm-hmm. Let's say for this particular recall, there's no evidence of direct US involvement, and that's only reasonable because this doesn't involve regime change. The other cases that you cited oftentimes is using civic group to instigate a regime change, but this one doesn't involve a regime change. So there's no evidence of direct involvement and little suspicion about direct funding. However, there are major operators in Taiwan politics supported and long-term associated with the organizations you talked about. For example, the NED, the Freedom House, or Open Society Foundation. Two of them are most notable. One is Shen Boyang, who is currently a DPP MP legislator. He's an at-large MP, so he didn't go through district election. In fact, he was the second highest nominated, so in the rank. For a young person to hold that rank, people does suspect has something to do with his long-term U.S. relationship. And he's being supported by NED, Freedom House, Open Society Foundation with trackable funding. In addition to that, he's currently held the Doublethink Lab. And for your audience, they would know what Doublethink Lab is. It's being used in many, many societies. So he has a very strong focal position with the DPP and U.S. link in terms of the so-called value-based democracy movements worldwide. And he does hold key position in this general recall. He spoke out. He was in many rallies, and he was one of the most notable spokesperson for the general recall. And actually, most notable spokesperson accusing KMT of pro-China and selling out Taiwan. The second one, who is very well grounded with lots of evidence, is Tang Feng, Audrey Tang. He is now self-proclaimed as a woman, so he is the DEI darling. Tang Feng was supported by the United States, and therefore he held a Ministry of No Portfolio, and later on he held the position of Minister of Digital Affairs. He set up all the fact-checking, digital monitoring, social media monitoring systems for the government. And the government has spent huge amount of money to wage a online warfare organization. There are actually many online warfare organizations. So both Shen Boyang and Tang Feng, both of these two are major operatives of DPP in the online and digital warfare movements. So if you look at this, even though there may not be direct involvement, but during the last administration, because I think the current administration is a bit different. During the last administration, they have a very strong connection with Taiwan's movements in terms of being a value partner, in terms of supporting its diversity agenda, and so on and so forth. So you can say that there are embedded strategic alignments within the DPP upper echelon and in the legislative yuan that would support the so-called civic groups in waging the local campaigns to recall KMT members.
Up to a certain degree, these kind of connections are natural and what you would expect, right? I mean, certain groups just have different value structures and think like we should be closer to the US or we should be closer to other countries, and then they try to rally for that. I mean, to a certain extent, this is normal. Where it becomes abnormal is where decision making is outsourced, and you have places like the US embassy that basically directs certain efforts that then lead to let's say mass demonstrations, and of such kind of activities, at least for this recall, we have no indication there of your saying.
We have no evidence and indication, not as clear as during the Sunflower Movement. The Sunflower Movement and the Hong Kong movement has clear indication of direct involvement, and even with headquarters helping them set up strategies. But I think it's important to note that people like Shen Boyang, who's being supported by those organizations, the U.S. organizations, for a long, long time, before they surfaced on the political arena. And even today, while he is holding a political position in the legislative yuan as a legislator, his families are still making money in mainland China when he accused others of being pro-China. So these double standards have been exposed this time, and showing perhaps there are other reasons to prompt them to do such a direct and harsh attack on anybody with a China connection.
So overall, where do you think this leaves us now that there's a second round of recalls coming up with like 7 more legislators, but as you said, the expectation is that they will probably also be reaffirmed. Where does this leave us in terms of Taiwan? And, we must recall, like, Taiwan is the Republic of China, right? The official name. I mean, we have an unresolved situation out of the Civil War.
Yes.
And we have mainland China with the People's Republic. So the Republic and the People's Republic, where does this leave us in terms of foreign policy, where these political entities can go?
Well, I think at this point we have a little breathing room. If all 31 MPs were recalled, that it's easy for China to conclude that there's no potential of a political negotiation across Taiwan Straits, because then DPP will say they get the people's mandate and they will have control of all 5 branches. And China may conclude that there's no chance of a peaceful resolution and they may opt to go to the other route. So at this point, since this recall is stemmed at this point, and the August 23rd will also be stemmed, I hope, then DPP will not be able to claim that they got the people's mandate to claim Taiwan independence and to push the tension across Taiwan Strait any further.
I mean, that's good news. That means, from the internal political process in Taiwan, we would rather expect no significant change in the status quo or the rhetoric toward the status quo.
Yeah, because DPP still held its base core, right? The 28%-ish in some of the districts. Other districts, they dropped to about 20%. But their core district, they still have some places they held their core. So we must understand that DPP didn't fail as a party, even though they used an anti-China theme for this general recall. But as a party, it didn't fail. So the local politics will still go as usual, which will be holding a local election in 2026 very quickly. Very soon, there will be local election with all county magistrates, local mayors, and city councils. Now, but I think it's important to send to the outside world that the people in Taiwan do not all subscribe to DPP's claim of a strong support for Taiwan independence extremists. And it's sending this message both to mainland China and to the United States, and hopefully to the rest of the world who wanted to play white knights to come and rescue Taiwan from the big bad wolf across Taiwan Straits. Because the rhetoric or the playbook DPP has played to the world is that we are the model democracy, we're the value partner, and the big bad wolf across Taiwan Straits will invade us. So you, global powers, come and protect us and to protect the lifeline in Taiwan Strait. So protecting Taiwan is one thing. Protecting Taiwan Strait as an economic lifeline is a second cause for the international powers to play the white knights. And we've seen this. Recently, the British ex-prime minister came to Taiwan and said he is willing to support Taiwan if there were tension. You have the French, the Dutch, and the British all came to our side of the world and saying they would be our white knights. So if people outside of Taiwan think that everybody wanted to go to war with the Taiwan independence stance by Lai Ching-te, and we're willing to sacrifice ourselves to the last man standing, therefore you have to come to us, then they may make a wrong strategic decision. But this time, the recall is sending a different message saying that, hey, wait a second, most people in Taiwan actually want the status quo. And in fact, in the political arena, it's still separated. It's divided. It's not a universal stance backing the current president.
That is true. The unfortunate fact, though, is that even with with large support of the general public for reconciliation with the other it's still possible to push countries over the edge. And we've seen that in Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky won his election with nearly 60% or so, like quite high on a platform to reconcile with Russia. But it was very quickly reined in, among others, by the NGOs and by pressure from the West and by his own ultranationalists. Now, for Taiwan, I don't think we have that type of ultranationalists that would threaten others with death if they don't go for independence, and we might not have as strong a NGO network to push for escalatory measures. But do we now also have in the KMT a party that kind of got reaffirmation that trying to have lower level, not presidential level, but lower level ties with the PRC would be possible? I mean, because I recall that your former president, once he was not president anymore, Mr. Ma Ying-jeou, he sometimes goes on goodwill tours to the mainland, and that kind of fosters an understanding that there is a group in Taiwan that actually wants to have more better relationship with the mainland, right? Is that now on the cards?
I think there are two thresholds and very difficult to pass by KMT, and they have to work in concert with TPP. One is the strong imaginatory anti-China sentiment has been permeating in Taiwan society for about 6 months. People started hating China for no reason or for imaginary reasons. So you need to use a lot of fact-based or experience-based spokesperson to gradually change that spiral of silence. So without that being changed, no politicians will overtly express a willingness to work with mainland China, even on the economic ground, because that will be seen as a political suicide. So you can see Taichung Mayor Lu Xiuyan, he wanted to resolve a lot of Taiwan's issues, and the best possible places to offer her solutions, it's probably mainland China, but she decided to go to Australia instead of going to China. And I think that is a very sort of calculated, smart political move, not to subject yourself to huge criticism without having solid beneficial results. So the number one is the zeitgeist, the general sentiment has to be gradually changed a little bit. And we're seeing a little sunshine there. There is a YouTuber whose name is館長, who is a very interesting character. He was a critic of KMT, but he went to China and saw for his own eyes and saw how he has been misled by DPP. So he is now hugely popular and has huge following, and he has reached young people beyond belief, people that you and I will not be able to reach. So there will be a lot of personal sentiment and personal testimony gradually changing this misnomer and misinformation. But secondly, there is definitely a need for KMT to work with TPP, not just because you want to add up your votes, but because your supporters are complementary. KMT has a lot of senior elitist supporters, and TPP has a lot of young, enthusiastic supporters. And in fact, I think they have groomed a lot of young potential politicians suitable for local level elections, better than KMT. So if they can work in concert, even though their whole sort of nationalistic platform is still different, they are both okay to work with China, but in terms of how to move forward, still have different strategies. But in the local election, if the two can work together, then you will have a 2026 election showing a new Taiwan in terms of its outlook to the rest of the world, namely the United States and China.
Maybe toward the end, I mean, can you just tell me how it is possible that politically it's still so difficult to work with the mainland, even on a provincial level, when in fact China, the mainland, is your largest trading partner? Imports and exports, it's the largest one. I mean, so the goods go back and forth, services too, as far as I know, and but somehow on the political level, it's still not really possible to work together. Why is that?
Unfortunately, tourism is now almost closed.
Tourism is almost closed.
Entry visas. So it's almost closed. And even scholastic exchange are almost closed. So that's really unfortunate. But let's look at 2008 to 2016. During the Ma Ying-jeou time, we have agreed to sign agreements across Taiwan Straits, over 20 agreements, over 11, 12 high-level ministerial level meetings. We resolved all practical issues of how to make people going back and forth to be exchange scholars, students, exchange to do businesses across each other's. So we have a long-term relationship and we could do those. So the only hurdle at this point is just the political ideology. It's not just even politics. It's a simple ideological obstruction to a most reasonable business relationship that's win-win. To back up what you said, in terms of the tariff we're dealing with the United States, if you look at outside of the semiconductor, the other things we sell to the United States are of mid-level manufacturing and low margin. The ones we'll sell to mainland China are of high margin. So their contribution to the wealth of Taiwan is much greater than even the total trade number. So to not want to work with China is stupid and suicidal, especially after TSMC and all these crown jewels will be plucked and transplanted to Arizona. So if you are Lai Ching-te, you have to look at how to move Taiwan's economy going forward in the post-tariff era. And that is your number one challenge. And if you don't do that, and if you don't open to mainland China tourists, businesses, cross-strait exchanges, then you almost have no other substitute of such a big hole left by the absence of U.S.
Yeah, but I mean, the U.S. is puts very high tariffs on Taiwan
100%.
as well, and the kind of extractive policies that the U.S. is following is also something that Taiwan is part of. So, do you think that also in the DPP this will lead to some rethinking of its foreign policy approach and economic approach?
Right now, there is one person who is the head of DPP's Mainland China Affairs Research Institute that spoke with some kind of openness and open-minded approach to cross-strait business relationship. The rest of them all followed Lai Ching-te because Lai Ching-te not only persecuted Ko Wen-je, which was the leader of TPP, the chairperson, persecuted party leaders in KMT, he also persecuted his own party's opposition. So there are people who are not under the Lai Ching-te fraction. They are being subject to the same prosecutorial investigation and being accused of embezzlement of funds or misuse of campaign funding and so on and so forth. So Lai Ching-te is very harsh and have an iron fist within his party, against opposition parties and against the rest of the people. He's holding a very tight line. So if you are still with DPP and you wanted to be nominated next year, then you would have to work under whatever Lai Ching-te tells you to do.
And that you are not expecting any rethinking on his part in terms of the strategic alliance with the United States or the not an alliance, but a working together.
With the United States, I think that's his hope. He's hoping that with the legacy left by Tsai Ing-wen and Bi-khim Hsiao with the prior government, which is the Democratic government, he would have enough legacy or chips to work with the current government. But I think he is probably miscalculating in this particular area because the last government loved Taiwan for being the first country that would do the DEI things according to their rules. But DEI is not what Trump likes. So whatever works for the previous government probably will not work for the current government. So if Lai Ching-te is betting on the legacy or the remainder of the goodwill, probably he'll have to think again.
Right. The problem is in the United States, like whatever you have to do in order to jump through their hoops, like the target changes, like by now basically on a daily basis. Joanna, did we to cover anything that is still important to know about the current state of Taiwan's affairs, or have we broadly like covered the parts of the
Probably there's one thing that I'd like to add, that is in terms of judicial branch. The day before the general recall, on July 25th, the 7 new nominated Supreme Court justices were not confirmed, so they were all vetoed. These 7 justices weren't just vetoed based on political reasons, but purely because they're not the proper candidates to hold the judicial branch. And if they got confirmed, the entire judicial branch will actually have a sea change. For example, the most notable one is the number 1 nominee who will, if confirmed, he will be the chairperson of our Supreme Court and will be the chairperson of our judicial yuan, which is the judicial branch. This person is a prosecutor. He's never been on the courtroom. He has no constitutional or judicial application. So he has no qualification in that. So if for years and years and years, our judicial reform is to separate the prosecutorial powers, which is entangled with the executive branch, and the judicial, the court system. So we try to separate these two to preserve some independence. If we use a head of the prosecutory system to head the judicial system, the courts, that is sending a very strong signal to the entire court system in civic, in criminal, and in administrative courts, and even to the Supreme Court and Constitutional Court. So all 7 of them were vetoed. So we narrowly escaped another possibility of having the judicial system completely reverted and under the control of the current executive branch. We preserved somehow, at least nominally, a possibility of separation of power and balance of power.
So in general, I mean, it's not just the recall, but also this judicial decision that shows that currently the different political forces inside Taiwan are balancing each other out, right? That's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that is because you still have a majority of KMT and TPP in the legislative yuan. Yeah. If the recall were successful, that you will have no protection against a total totalitarian system with all 5 branches under the same leader or the same party.
Right. Of course, the DPP will say like, no, this would all be like fair and square and fine and good and only for the mandates given. But I mean, this is where the political rhetoric then kicks in. Joanna Lei, this was very interesting. People who want to follow you, you also speak regularly in Chinese, right? On Taiwanese media?
Regularly on CTI. There is a Sunday night commentary program. So I am on that program on a regular basis.
Okay, if you want to follow Joanna Lei and you speak Chinese, then watch CTI Sunday night. Joanna Lei, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹饪。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。